G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with Baal Belbora, the end of the dancing, by Geoffery Blomfield. The agony of the British invasion of the ancient people of the Three Rivers, the Hastings, the Manning and the Macleay in New South Wales, published by the Colonial Research Society, Armidale. ISBN 909188904. In the 6-part series of the book review of the biggest estate on earth, think of this as part 7. Whereas this has explained how the country was made, what it looked like, where things were before 1788, this is the most authoritative book that I've yet discovered regarding what happened around here. This book particularly focuses on the country to the east and the south of here, but it does describe one incident north of here at Bluff Rock. So, let's have a look. Mounted Police and Blacks, sketched by Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Charles Mundy, who with Governor Fitzroy travelled up the Hastings River in 1846 to Yarrowitch and thence over to southern New England, and who expressed astonishment and horror at the participation of graziers in Massacre. Mitchell Library, Sydney. Cranky Tom and Dilbury, natives of the Yarrahapini tribe, called Cranky Tom for his irrepressible hilarity. Titled A Ritual, and what you've got is the warriors on one tribe lined up yelling and shouting, and one of them has stepped forward to take the spear of one of the warriors on the other tribe who's stepped forward to throw the spear, while his mates are all shouting and waving their spears. And there's probably been a 3-day corroboree before this event where the old men of both tribes have decided how serious the matter is they're fighting over and whether they're fighting to first, second or third blood. And a spear through the ear is as good as a spear through the belly button for the purposes of drawing blood. Okay, that's a tribal war before the Europeans showed up with their goody better fire sticks. Here we have the good country of Oz, and this is the particular part of New South Wales that we're looking at. Armidale's here, and if the map continued far enough up, I'm about here at Glen Innes. But you've got Wallumbye, Ebor, Bellbrook, Kempsey. My mother's father comes from around Kempsey. The one I think might be a secret part Aborigine. Port Macquarie, Warhope, Hastings River. This area here is the Falls. Walker on the east, Gloucester in the south. Same area showing when the white people showed up. 1821, 1832, 1828, 1828. 1836, 1836, 1836, 1839, 1836, 1836. So this is where the remnant population who were retreating from the sheep had to fall back on. Retreating from the sheep because the sheep ate all the wild native food plants first. This is a fairly disgusting thing to be in possession of, a map of the massacres. Darky Point, Sheep Station, Wobro, Towel Creek, Henderson's Creek, Boozers, Macleay, Kundarang, Elsinore, Waterloo, Cedar Cutters, Durrally Creek, Cat Camp Creek, Stony Creek, Garibaldi Rock, Kogo, Belbora, Gangat, Bowman's Flat, Mount Mackenzie, Wattenbacken, Waterloo again. Waterloo was a pretty popular name for a massacre site in those days. Down on the coast, where there were the resources for it, there were large tribes. Once upon a time you could always get a feed at the coast. Girls on the Beach, Port Macquarie, circa 1890. It points out that they've been on a whitefellas diet for a while and they've started to put on weight. Murray, an Aboriginal leader, mid-19th century, Hastings River. Department of Archaeology, Cambridge University. Aboriginal girl, mid-19th century, Hastings River. Also Department of Archaeology, Cambridge University. Bit of a warning here. This girl's bare-chested. Look away if you don't want to see a young Aboriginal girl bare-chested. Aboriginal men fishing with pronged spears on the Hastings River. The vegetation indicates they are close to the sea. The canoe is quickly made from a strip of bark, and the man usually has his wife with him. They also usually had a small fire and a clay base, so they could cook the fish and eat it as soon as they caught it. Fresh food, eh? This man is using a stone axe to cut toe holes to climb. You note, it's a hand axe. There's no wooden handle to it, unlike a tomahawk. The abundant life did not last much longer. On the beach, you could dig with your toes and come up with a feed of shellfish. Local conditions varied from locality to locality, and Aborigines adapted readily to varying conditions. This bloke's using a spear shaft to peel a sheet of bark from one side of a stringy bark tree. Don't peel it all the way around the tree, that might kill the tree. New England tableland. The first scouts of the British invasion of New England came up to the tableland from the inland. John Oxley, Surveyor General, and the first great explorer of the inland, was toiling over the southern shoulder of the tableland, making for the mouth of the Macleay River. The natives on the tableland were shy and remained at a distance. 9 years later, Alan Cunningham described them as shy and timorous. As well they might be, for they were not sure what to expect from these strangers who, as they would know, were armed with shooting sticks which dealt out death at a distance. They would know because their system of communications was fast and well in advance of anything from Europe. They could convey quite complex information by means of smoke signals, and there was as well contact between the tribes through travelling messengers, poets, dancers, singers, and it is known that large parties travelled from the northern rivers as far as south as the Hunter Valley for their great festivals. They would be informed about the movements of Oxley's party and the ways of these strangers who had arrived as if from another star. 17th of September 1818, Oxley had reached Yarrowitch, which is up to 4,000 feet above sea level and gives a grand view out over the Falls country. It's here that the tributaries of the three rivers almost meet. In a special report to the Legislative Council in 1845, George James MacDonald had this to say: "Their ordinary means of subsistence must have diminished to a considerable extent. The introduction of 500,000 sheep into the original hunting grounds of the district has nearly driven the kangaroo on which the natives formerly subsisted beyond its boundaries." MacDonald must also have known, but does not mention, that 60 to 70% of the Aboriginal food was made up of a wide range of vegetables and seeds. He may not have known that sheep are selective eaters and would have the best of the most succulent plants and seeds. In fact, that under their close grazing these species would disappear almost entirely. Dr. I.C. Campbell, writing of New England in those days, has this to say: "Whatever the nature of early contact, however, a clash of interest and an incompatibility of the value system soon became evident, and this led to a stage of intense violence. It can be said with certainty that the years 1839 to 1842 were particularly violent. There is the affair of the Bluff Rock Massacre near Tenterfield, 1844. A shepherd on the property of Irby Brothers, Bolivia, was murdered tending sheep. The body was found several days later floating in a nearby creek. It was naked, had several spear wounds, and was battered almost beyond recognition. It was a particularly gruesome murder. The Irby brothers understandably were incensed. With the help of their neighbour, Windayer of Deepwater, I take my rubbish to the deep water dump. How you going, Ant? You're on YouTube. They hunted for the offending Aborigines. They seem to have identified the offending group with some certainty, but this detail was not always observed. On finding the horde, they pursued them for some time. The Aborigines withdrew to high ground until they found themselves between a precipice and their pursuers. The entire group, men, women and children, were driven over the edge, with the exception of one small boy, the only survivor. This boy, incidentally, was brought up very successfully by one of the white men involved. They developed a strong feeling of devotion to one another. Events such as this are not isolated, but relatively few are recorded. Each race seemed to have a pervading horror, a persistent suspicion of the other, feelings which were both cause and symptom of the general attitude. There are, of course, exceptions, notably Robert Muir near Inverell, Thomas Toole near Uralla and Everett Brothers near Guyra. None of these three ever had any trouble with the natives, as far as I can ascertain, yet all three came to New England in 1838, the year which began the intensely violent era. So, there was so much violence it's easy to name the people who were not involved. Edward Irby, in his account of the Bluff Rock massacre, said, "If the natives had taken to their heels, they might well have got off safe. Instead of doing this, however, they got their fighting men together to attack us, so we punished them severely and proved our superiority to them." Alexander Harris tells us, he's described as a very reliable writer, "From time immemorial it has been the custom for influential settlers to head parties like this against the blacks." Lieutenant Colonel Godfrey Charles Mundy says, "More than once no less shocked than surprised to hear men of station and cultivation advocating a sweeping and indiscriminate retaliation by their subalterns and servants." He continued, "It was common after an inroad of the blacks upon the sheep and cattle, because they were starving, because the kangaroos had been run off and because there were no food plants, an inroad of the blacks upon the sheep and cattle for men of 2 or 3 adjoining stations to assemble for a regular and indiscriminate slaughter, in which young and old were shot down. Reprisals were undertaken on a large scale, a scale which never reaches the ears of government, or if it reached them at all finds them conveniently deaf. Men, women and children are butchered without distinction or stint. It becomes, by practice, a pleasurable excitement. Occasionally, bush gossip let out that the blackfellas were going to get a dose, and indeed, in more than one known instance, damper well hocussed with arsenic or strychnine was laid in the way of the savages, whereby many were killed. Some attempts were made to bring justice to the perpetrators of this cowardly as well as barbarous act, but in the bush justice is too often deaf, dumb and lame as well as blind. No doubt Colonel Mundy heard of the massacres of the Falls country. For instance, there is the story of an Aboriginal's head being hacked off and, to deter theft, placed in the sugar barrel. This same murderous procedure is supposed to have occurred in a hut at the wash pool on Burrakai Station, Yarrowitch. There is also the story of heads being spiked on every post of a stockyard. He describes massacres as, quote, brushes with the natives, butchering, you know. Morrison continues, "It is never thought sportsmanlike or honourable to kill or fire at a hare in the lair, and some consideration of this kind might fairly be pleaded in favour of the blacks." An adventure with the blacks. Closely written. Pouring in, therefore, upon the eager but unconscious crowd below the contents of 10 barrels, a fearful change was effected in their savage glee, a scream of mingled consternation and surprise, a rush in reckless despair towards the only means of escape from their exposed and dangerous elevation, a murderous and tumultuous struggle against themselves, their yells of mingled hate and agony as, grappling together in the last gasp of breath, the foremost of them fell, urged over the ledge's brink by the pressing crowd behind that madly hurried on into the yawning sepulchre beneath, was all of the horrid scene that the increasing darkness of the night enabled us to clearly perceive. We had now reloaded, and our party from below, pushing forward to the scene of conflict, poured in a deadly volley upon the thronging crowds that lined the rocky entrance to this fatal ledge. Back flew the despairing wretches from that dreadful spot. Again a volley from our party on the heights dealt frightful havoc in their ranks. The utmost wildness of despair now seized upon them all. Some actually dashed themselves in frantic violence to the depths beneath, in utter heedlessness of life. One solitary tree grew in this fatal glen, its topmost limbs reaching almost to the level of their feet. With faint remains of hope, some of the youngest and most active of the tribes sprang at its fragile boughs in vain. Few grasped its treacherous aid, where, quivering for a moment on its yielding branches, their later shrieks of dying agony mingling with the mass beneath, sick of the horrid carnage below, I fain would have retired from the dreadful spot, but all my efforts, entreaties, threats were utterly useless. Shot after shot, with their curses wild and deep, the excited fellows launched at their hated foes. Their butchered comrades' blood was that night fearfully avenged. Right, that's what happens when you speared a shepherd. Massacres of the Tableland. Garibaldi Rock Massacre. The Aboriginal Garibaldi did not lead an army, for there were no Aboriginal armies, but he was undoubtedly a leader, a powerful personality who left a strong impression behind him which still lingers in the minds of the descendants of the pioneer families. Garibaldi Rock, which stands 2,000 feet above his grave, is a fitting memorial. There are 2 mass graves at the site of the massacre, with a meat ant's nest on each grave. The last days of the ancient people of New England. Aboriginal people living in humpies at a town verge about 1920. They have now lost everything and belong nowhere. Outcasts and beggars. Paintings in the Mitchell Library. It's called The Avengers. Men with guns sneaking up on an unarmed camp. Pencil drawing of Aborigines attacking a settler's slab hut. (1844 to 1846). It's in the Mitchell Library. Hostilities on the Manning. The Harmony. The poisoning of Aboriginal people was known as the Harmony because in this way peace was supposed to have been achieved. It was not peace but submission which was achieved, and hate and distrust were buried in the Aboriginal subconscious. The Aboriginal today pretends to know nothing, but if full trust can be established, it will be found that he does know, or she does know. Poisoning is the most cowardly form of massacre, and the Aboriginal race do not forget, despite their kindly nature. 2 cases of the Harmony, one a substantial one in the early 30s, the other a minor one in 1847. The same location is given for both these poisonings, Upper Gangat. Fitzpatrick doesn't comment on this, and the poisonings are so far apart in time it's impossible to say if they are one and the same or 2 separate massacres. Of the earlier and major case, he writes, Belbora alludes to the Gangat tragedy in the early 30s and is more applicable to Upper Gangat, where hostile Walamba natives died thick from the effects of arsenical poisoning. Gruesome and dark is that partly forgotten tale, justifiable only in the fact that the unfortunate whites concerned were beleaguered and wounded, and the poison dampers were their last defensive resort. In every creek and in every gully lay dead blacks. To the blacks the name became an anathema. Knew them no more, sick, hence the name Baal Belbora, the end of the dancing. But men were callous and life was cheap in those far-off days, and tradition tells a yet weirder tale of a blood bounty at ½ a crown per head. Fitzpatrick gives a further account. 1847, I remember a number of blacks being poisoned at Upper Gangat. Their graves were fresh when I first struck the locality. It appears the blacks had been giving trouble to a couple of stockmen, had attacked them in fact, and the stockmen had barricaded themselves in a hut. They had had a supply of poison with them to poison native dogs. Dampers were made, and some of the poison was evidently mixed with the dampers. Some of them were thrown out of the hut. Several of the blacks demolished them and speedily died. The remainder took to their heels and left the scene. The writer P.J. Hurley gives a further and again different account in his book Red Cedar. And that's how harmony was established in this part of Australia. If you couldn't shoot them, poison them. To establish a domain where sheep have more land rights than the Aborigines. Ciao.